Good morning and good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to this conversation today about state leadership and state policy to improve school climate. My name is Danielle Gonzales, Director of the Aspen Institute Education and Society Program, and we'll be joined by amazing panelists today, which I'll introduce in just a minute. Before we jump into that though, I know most of us have become quite familiar with Zoom by this point, so briefly I'll just provide some guidance for how we'll be using the functions on the webinar for today. So just want to encourage everyone to use the chat box to share resources and reactions and follow along with the conversation as we're going, and to use the Q&A function if you want to ask a question for any of the panelists. We'll be tracking those questions and responding there. And if there's a specific panelist you want to direct your question towards, you could do that as well within the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can also tweet. We encourage you to follow along on Twitter and to tweet using the hashtag School Climate, hashtag #EdEquity, or hashtag #EdPolicy, or all three of them if you want to be really, really into it. So just wanted to start by saying how much this is a really critical and important conversation that we're having right now, this conversation about school climate. As our nation faces intersecting health, economic, and social crises, a focus on school climate and the learning experience and the student experience does so much for our schools right now. A focus on school climate enables academic learning, it advances equity and fosters a sense of belonging for kids. It allows our pandemic recoveries to actually focus on re-engaging students and fostering their safety, and to tend to both their social, emotional, and mental health needs, as well as academic needs and the impacts of school closures. Importantly, school climate surveys also provide really concrete and reliable data to help policymakers and system leaders understand school quality and how well our students are being served amidst disruption to learning and to other assessment measures. So all of this is why we partnered with ExcelinEd and engaged over 80 other education leaders to develop this resource. We hosted roundtables and even a remote dinner. We reviewed academic research. We interviewed state policymakers. We interviewed students and teachers and others, and explored lots of legislative statute and state board regulations. We reviewed ESSA state plans, and we also vetted all of the recommendations we made with an amazing group of scholars, researchers, partners, students, and other leaders. And so just want to express tremendous appreciation over 80 plus people who were involved in creating this amazing resource that we're excited to share with you today. We hope that the recommendations that we put into the state policy playbook provide something for every state, no matter where they are on the continuum of prioritizing school climate. In fact, I'm really excited to share that the playbook actually features examples from 38 states and DC. And it also, we think, is a great complement to a resource that we released this summer focused on school and district actions to improve climate. So there's ways that action can be taken at the very local level all the way on up to the state level. With that, I'm really proud to introduce our partner in this work, Lizzette Gonzales Reynolds, who is the Vice President for Policy for ExcelinEd. Lizzette?
Lizzette, you're on mute.
Hi, you'd think I'd figured that out by now on the mute. Thank you, Danielle. So I work for the Foundation for Excellence in Education, which is founded by former Governor Jeb Bush of Florida. Our organization supports policymakers across the country to bring strong student-centered education policies to life. We are thrilled to partner with our colleagues at the Aspen Education and Society Program in bringing you both recommendations and state examples wherein school climate policy has been established with the goal of supporting student learning within and beyond the schoolhouse door. And in light of COVID, in response to families wanting some sense of normalcy, many of us in the education policy community have been exploring not only how we get back to school, but how we ensure that business as usual is the exception as opposed to the rule. This requires us to work together to reimagine learning, wherein high academic expectations combined with strong school climate enables each and every student the opportunity to reach their fullest potential while also preparing them for post-secondary success. This also requires support to our educators to be better equipped to integrate the science of learning and development at the different stages of each student's life. It is not an or, but an and into the day-to-day instruction, because while we want all of our students learning, we also want them to be engaged in both strong and healthy peer-to-peer and adult student relationships. And it is the development of those relationships that students are going to be able to build character and understand their role as a partner in their own student experience. Our kids want to be successful, but we have to support them in ways where the academic framework is supported by caring adults. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Lizzette. In addition to the Climate Playbook, which we're releasing today, we're also super excited to share a letter of support from over 30 organizations who prioritize this issue. And we encourage others listening today to take a look at the letter and to join in on this call to action by signing on to the letter to prioritize school climate. If you are interested in signing on, adding your organization's name, we will put in the chat. You can just send an email to educationinfo@aspeninstitute.org, and we will follow up with you about adding your logo to the letter. Now, onto our panel. As I mentioned, we are joined by three amazing leaders today. So Lizzette and I have the tremendous privilege of co-facilitating this session this morning. We are joined by Carmen Ayala, who is the State Superintendent of Education for Illinois, LeeAnne Cornyn, who is the Director of Children's Initiatives for the Office of Governor Mike DeWine of Ohio, and by Krupa Hegda, who is a high school senior and the Regional Field Director for the Kentucky Student Voice Team. Again, as we get into this panel, I'm encouraging everyone to follow along in the chat box, adding reactions, and also to ask questions for the panelists using the Q&A function on the Zoom webinar. So with that, I want to start the conversation by turning to our student panelist, Krupa. So we have up on the screen a definition of school climate, and school climate basically just describes the quality and the character of the school and captures the experience of students, teachers, other staff, and even the community within a learning environment. So Krupa, can you just kick us off by telling us what it is like to be a student in school today? And I know you can't speak for every student out there, but what do you and your peers experience in terms of feeling like you belong, feeling a sense of physical and emotional safety, and fostering healthy relationships with adults and others in your school?
Yeah, thanks, Danielle, for having me. And I think I'll just preface this by reiterating what you said, that I by no means can possibly represent every single student and their experiences in this moment, especially with everything being as varied as it is. But I think something that is really key in terms of school climate that we're noticing right now is that school climate isn't just what's in the four brick walls of a school anymore. It's what a student is bringing to their school, whether it's online or in an actual building. Students are really bringing their home experiences to school. And I think that's something that we've always noticed, but it's something that's all the more prevalent now with so much of school being online. And so I think that we're really, something that me and my peers have been talking a lot about is how impactful our home lives are on our school being and how well we're feeling in school right now. And so I think that that's something that's been striking me lately as so key to fostering a really good school environment. But I think another thing that we're really noticing right now is that student agency and student power is something that's really growing at this moment. I think in this in virtual learning, students have agency and they're, taking charge of their education fully. And it's something that students are really proud of. And I'm noticing so many students, being open to this idea of student voice and taking charge and initiative in their learning and being partners with those adults. And I think in terms of school climate, something I personally feel like a sense of belonging is when teachers and students are co-facilitating their environments. Teachers and students are working together to create an environment that's conducive to all students in that classroom. So I think, to end that statement, I think what we're noticing a lot is that school climate looks very different in this moment, but it's also a moment that we have a lot of agency to create change and create a positive school climate for everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Krupa. And I think important to acknowledge, even as we're talking about how important school climate and a focus on school climate is right now, this is something that has always mattered, that we know from research and from students has always mattered. So really important to think about how we know how students are experiencing their school. Really appreciate you flagging the importance of the home connection, the importance of student agency, and the importance of relationships between teachers. I'd love to turn to Superintendent Ayala and to LeeAnne and just hear any reactions you have to Krupa's framing.
I think that Krupa made some really great points. I've been in the field now. This is my 38th year. And yes, I started teaching when I was 10. And I was trained initially as a teacher of English learners. And I remember when Krupa was talking, Stephen Krashen. And Stephen Krashen is a researcher that talked about this affective filter. And when the affective filter is up, right, students don't feel safe, they don't feel comfortable, they don't feel listened to or valued. Learning is difficult to penetrate that filter. And so it does have an impact. So school culture does have an absolute impact on learning. And when we can lower that filter, just imagine what can be accomplished in the classrooms. And in Illinois, we have 852 separate distinct districts. All kinds of sizes, all kinds of demographics, all kinds of communities, rural, suburban, urban. And so it's important to recognize that each school, each district is unique and has a community that brings its culture into the schools. And so that's an important point too that I think Krupa mentioned as well.
I'll just add that, certainly Krupa really demonstrates that our young people are brilliant and competent and clearly able to articulate their needs. Although it seems like yesterday for me, it's been 15 years since I was in high school, and culture and society has absolutely shifted since that point. So, I can sit here and I can tell you what the research and the science may say about what our evidence-based practices for transforming school culture, but it's much harder, like the superintendent said, to tell you what's going to be relevant or engaging or culturally responsive to the school districts across Ohio. We have 610, so Illinois has us beat by a few. And I think Krupa really mentioned that school is very different and climate is going to be very different. Our students are going to be very, very different when they finally all return for in-person learning. And that's going to be a paradigm shift even since, the 2019-2020 school year. So I think now more than ever, it's absolutely critical to one, ask our kids how they're doing, and two, what they need. I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but our major source of funding for whole child initiatives here in Ohio is called Student Wellness and Success. And, student, I think, is the operative word in there. So how can we design and, build out the kind of supports that students need to be well and successful if we're not talking to our students? My boss, Governor Mike DeWine, when he was Attorney General, he built a step-by-step guide for schools and communities to kind of build out some of these supports and services. And step number one was listening to the community, and that includes students. And I think that the superintendent really articulated this well. The greatest success stories that I've ever seen are when school districts listen to community members, and especially community members that reflect the culture and the demographics of their community. And I think that is absolutely essential.
Yeah, thank you all for that. I think one of the key points that I'm hearing is really about how much this opportunity really represents a shift from a focus that has historically been on measuring students towards an opportunity to really measure systems and to measure environments and to learn from students and families about their experience, which then allows us to provide supports that are, to Carmen's point, relevant and engaging and responsive to the diversity of experience that we're hearing about from all of our panelists. I wanted to say, Lizzette, if you have any reactions, and then we'll move to our next question.
Yeah, thank you for all of that. All of this kind of spins around my head, especially as a mom, right, with 3 teenagers, and really thinking about their different individual experiences, particularly during this time and even before. And so it's just like you said, it's going to be so different. And so how are we going to re-engage them in a way where it isn't, as I mentioned before, business as usual, where it's the teacher at the front, no connection with the kids in their classroom, no connections to the outside, like really looking at how we build that community on that campus. And as LeeAnne said, really recognizing what are the local values that need to be preserved in order to bring that onto the classroom. onto the campus.
Yeah. So I opened this up by talking a little bit about the why for this work and why we think, based on the research and the conversations we've had, particularly with the districts in our Aspen Urban District Network, this issue is so important. But I'd love to turn that same question back to our panelists and hear from each of you. We can start with Superintendent Ayala and then go to LeeAnne and then Krupa. Can you just tell us a little bit about why you think, especially now, we need this focus on school climate?
Sure, Danielle. In Illinois, we are using a survey, the 5 Essentials Survey. And this survey was developed by the University of Chicago's Consortium on School Research to measure climate and culture. The survey covers 5 domains, and schools, as we've been looking at survey results that demonstrate at least some strength on at least 3 of those measures, are 10 times more likely than other schools to have greater achievement results. And schools where students report healthy learning environments also have better attendance, they have fewer discipline incidents, and better long-term outcomes. Listening and responding to the experiences of our students leads to more successful schools. So without student voice, school evaluation would be based primarily on test scores and would overlook other important climate factors that lead to school improvement. So in Illinois, student participation rates in the climate survey is one of our school accountability indicators under ESSA. It's that important. And it's important for a couple of reasons. First, it emphasizes our belief that effective schools value feedback directly from students and staff. And second, by focusing on participation rates and not the ratings themselves, our indicator minimizes pressure to game survey responses to make schools look better. The purpose here is so that schools and communities have some necessary data for improvement that is holistic, not to be punitive towards schools that, especially schools that need support. As we know, school climate reflects the norms, the goals, the values, the relationships, the teaching and leadership practices, and organizational structures. Our supports for high-need schools aim to identify and address these underlying systemic and structural gaps. And so data that we find within the 5 Essentials Survey is critical in this needs assessment, and it is a critical part of the school improvement process.
So I love being part of these sessions because it's an opportunity to learn about the really incredible work that, our neighboring states are doing. And, Superintendent, that sounds really incredible, the 5 essential surveys and how you're embedding that into school improvement. A little bit about Ohio's context, and I want to kind of frame this up maybe a little bit more holistically, but really the context for our school climate work in Ohio is rooted in a slightly different epidemic, and that is the opioid epidemic. Tragically, Ohio was kind of ground zero for many of the pill mills in the early 2000s. And we continue to lose hundreds and thousands of lives every year to unintentional overdoses. And unfortunately, 2020 has been a pretty lethal year for Ohio. And I know that many states are seeing this as well. And we know that that's really disproportionately impacting our families here in Ohio. The majority of those who lose their lives are really between the ages of 25 and 44. So those are our families of childbearing and child rearing age. So even before the pandemic began, we know that our kids were experiencing some pretty significant trauma here in the state. In fact, about half of our 2.3 million kids here in Ohio have at least one adverse childhood experience, and 1 in 7 has 3 or more. So we knew that we really had to start doing things differently. And certainly the pandemic has added to some of this need and some of this demand. Like a lot of other states, we're seeing an increase in need for behavioral health services. Preliminary data from our 6 freestanding children's hospitals is showing a pretty sizable reduction in inpatient and outpatient visits, but a spike in behavioral health visits. So outpatient visits are down by 20%, inpatient by roughly 26%. But our behavioral health admissions and visits are up 10% across the board almost. And anecdotally, our kids are showing up sicker with more severe needs, more severe trauma. So if there ever has been really a time to focus on and invest in this work, I really feel like it's now. And the one thing that I just really want to articulate is that this isn't just one more thing. And I think that Illinois has clearly demonstrated that this is now baked into their DNA to add to schools' plates. I think that it really is sort of the one thing that we have to do now that can unlock greater learning and success for all of our students as they're returning to campus.
Yeah, I think the other panelists did such a great job of framing why school climate is important. I think we've always known that it's important, but like to put it simply, if a student feels well at school, both physically, emotionally, socially, and mentally, they're going to want to be there and they're going to want to engage in their education. So I think, paramount to everything, school climate is key to unlocking students' like true potential in their education and in their education systems. To give you a little context about my work with student voice and school climate, I think I've always known what school climate is, even in elementary school, you feel better in certain classrooms than other classrooms. And then as I progressed, I think I was very fortunate enough to get the vocabulary to characterize that as school climate and what that means to me. But my work at the Kentucky Student Voice team, really grounded itself on that, in that students know how they feel in classrooms. Students know how they feel in their school building. And it's students that have the best perspective on changing and what they want their school to be like. So we kind of rooted ourselves in that idea and started doing what we deemed these school climate audits, in which we would have students take power and agency in creating these surveys, asking the questions that they wanted to know about their school, because they're the ones who see what is going on every day. And we really thought that they would be the best stakeholders to, administer, deliver, and analyze that data that came from these surveys. So we've been doing that and engaging in that work for the past couple of years now. And I think students really provide such a unique perspective on that when they are the ones who are creating these surveys and disseminating them to their peers and getting that data and sharing back that data with students. It's creating this atmosphere of conducive change for students, and being able to make those decisions is something really important. So I think that, that work has really grounded me in this idea of how important student voice and school climate is. But I think, put simply, if a student wants to be at school, they'll be there.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, it's all that ability just to be where you want to be, right? And be able to learn at the same time. So, LeeAnne, I wanted to ask you a question. You work in the Office of Ohio. Oh my gosh, the Office of the Governor of Ohio and Mike DeWine. Could you speak to how school climate is connected to and supports existing initiatives of the governor's office, including Ohio's Whole Child Framework, student wellness funding, and the other whole child efforts that y'all have been pursuing?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. So as I mentioned, really Governor DeWine's focus on this started when he was Ohio's Attorney General and really looking at some of the root causes of the opioid epidemic in Ohio. As he was traveling the state, he frequently would meet with and run into teachers, superintendents, parents, grandparents who were caring for their grandchildren, and hear about how the trauma of parental addiction was really impacting school climate and also students' academic success. So we started really kind of looking at schools that were doing things differently to really better meet their kids' physical and mental health needs. So, whether that was on-site physical health services or mentoring programs or food and clothing banks or social and emotional learning programs, you name it, really kind of digging into schools that were innovating the way that they were connecting with their kids. And when he came into office, he, in his very first budget, included a brand new funding line called Student Wellness and Success. It's a $675 million line designed to really help schools replicate some of the innovative whole child initiatives that he saw as Attorney General. And every single one of our public, chartered, non-public, and vocational schools across the state receive funding to implement at least one of 11 eligible services that really range from targeted interventions for homeless and foster youth, to physical and behavioral health services, to additional supports for family engagement, and certainly other investments. And in order to invest these funds, we really required schools to partner with other community organizations. So that could be a local board of alcohol, drug, and addiction, a local board of developmental disabilities, a children's hospital, a local nonprofit. There were 8 different eligible partners. And I think what's really important is that this is not just the responsibility of a school, it's the responsibility of the community, because these are all of our kids. So really what we wanted to do was create community level investment and support for our kids. So that was in addition to $20 million in one-time investment in prevention education that allowed schools to kind of build up universal prevention and social emotional learning strategies, and also trauma training for teachers. And collectively, our goal was really to help schools build out some tiered supports and interventions for kids. Universal prevention strategies to help kids deal with the social and emotional skills they need to cope with life's daily stressors, trauma-informed training so that our teachers can have that deep emotional connection with kids, that they can identify risk factors and better refer and intervene when additional supports are needed. And then those higher level supports when kids do indicate a deeper need. And, I think this work really aligns so well with our State Board of Education's statewide PBIS framework and their whole child strategic plan, and collectively through really broad-based partnerships with education, behavioral health, physical health, child welfare, really you name it, they came to the table to create this statewide whole child framework, this collective vision that is really essential for us to sustain these investments and these partnerships long-term. And I just want to close by highlighting one example that I think really is emblematic of when schools and communities prioritize this work, unbelievable things can happen. We have a really fantastic school, Highland Elementary. It's a Columbus City school, and it's located in one of our most impoverished neighborhoods of Columbus that struggles deeply with addiction and poverty and crime and homelessness. They were averaging 1 suspension or expulsion every single day. They implemented a PBIS framework. They trauma trained all of their teachers. They brought in school-based mental and physical health care services. And within a matter of a few years, they are effectively at 0 suspensions and expulsions. You walk the halls and it's quiet, there's active learning happening, and they've dramatically improved their reading and math scores. So if that community can do it, any school can do it. It is achievable.
Thank you so much for that wonderful example and evidence as well. I know that's something that people are always asking, like, what does this look like in practice and how do I do it? I think the other really important thing, LeeAnne, from your comments is just the coherence that you're building in Ohio around all of these different, often siloed initiatives, programs, policies, and even funding streams. So just in your remarks, you mentioned MTSS, or multi-tiered systems of support, PBIS, child welfare, coordination with other agencies, and just kudos to you and the Ohio Governor's Office for this important work, because we all know that coordination and collaboration is challenging in normal times, but certainly more so in these very unusual times. But I think the other thing from your comment is just how much that underscores a point that Superintendent Ayala made about this isn't just one more thing. This is a way of pulling all of those elements together and really digging in to learn much more about the student experience, to Krupa's point. And so just wanted to acknowledge we have a lot of questions coming in. Some are very specific and tactical questions for each of our panelists about what this has looked like in practice. So just wanted to flag that each of our panelists' work is highlighted within the playbook itself. We actually have a case study that was authored by students about the Kentucky work, and we have a case study about the Illinois work as well. And of course, Ohio's work is featured. So encourage folks to check out the playbook for more specifics. But before we do turn to those questions that are coming in, I just have one last question for you, Superintendent Ayala. You shared the really strong history of using the 5 Essentials survey, starting in Chicago and then going across the state. And again, Illinois' work is highlighted in the playbook. I'd be curious if you could just speak to other education chiefs or how state I can never say it, chief school officers are thinking about school climate. What are you hearing from your peers about what are the opportunities to use climate and climate measures to respond to the disruption of the pandemic and to really support transition back to school?
Yes, you know, we all know that, excuse me, remote learning and the pandemic, as well as the recent events that have dealt with a lot of bias and racial and inequities, they have had a major impact on how students and families and our own educators experience school now and what they need going forward to be successful. We use the 5 essential survey information and are going to use it even now more than ever to help steer each school's recovery from the disruptions of 2020 and inform the transition back to in-person instruction. And so the really nice thing is we have got historical data on school culture, right? Climate and culture. And now we will be administering the climate and school culture survey this spring. And it will really, if we see some differences, if we see some nuances, we're able to add questions to that survey, and we will be adding specific COVID impact questions that will really give us some insights into some patterns that will emerge, that we can begin to take a look at some policy decisions or some funding decisions and areas of great need that need more attention in our state. And so our survey tool is going to allow not only at the state level, policy level, but will also be used at the school level, at the district level, to add their own 5 questions. They will have the opportunity to add some questions to the survey and to gather information about their unique community needs and challenges that they may be facing in the local community. We collaborated with a group of local, internal, external stakeholders to develop these COVID-specific questions to gather additional input concerning the learning environment throughout the pandemic. And we also adjusted the survey window from fall to spring. And so I think that was very important so that we can get more information into the hands of our leaders, because right now there's a lot of anecdotal information. And so the survey and the results coming from the survey will help to solidify what we're learning through conversations and experiences being shared, but it will give us then the data to be able to work with a lot of these things that are coming up. So as we come back into the physical classroom, the principles of health, culture, and climate will be more important now more than ever. We've got, you know, the 5 areas in our survey: effective leaders, collaborative teachers, involved and engaged families, and a safe and supportive environment, along with ambitious instruction. Those areas, I think there's going to be some interesting data that will be coming forth this spring as we compare what the data was looking like pre-pandemic, if you will. So we might be tempted sometimes to sacrifice our efforts in one of these areas in order to move more quickly, or because we have so much to do in such a short amount of time, but I caution against that. You know, I think it's because of these pillars of culture and climate that I often say that it's the plate on which everything rests. Because if you're not feeling good, if you're not feeling safe, if you're not truly feeling like you're a part of, then you can't really be as successful as you can be. And so I think there's good information that will come out. And I think that Illinois having the survey in place, I think is a blessing. And that we have the ability to seek the input of our parents, of our teachers, and of our students, and really see the impact of not only COVID, but the impact of, you know, current event kinds of things that will impact the learning when all of our children return back to in-person learning.
Well, I really appreciate that. And, you know, one of the things that you said earlier in your remarks is that none of this is expected to be punitive, right? That is not at the point of this work. And so as you articulate as states, right, LeeAnne or Chief Superintendent Ayala, how do you communicate that down to the local level, right? To say, look, this is about supporting your environment. It's not about creating some level of sticks that is going to, that's going to break you down. I mean, so I'm just real curious to hear how those communications are going.
Well, I mentioned earlier, we do not, the 5 essential survey information is transparent. It is a part of each school's report card, so that the community can take a look at the school culture and the climate and what their students and staff are saying about it. But we look at participation because we really want to encourage as many students and parents and staff to participate in the survey. And I think that that's a very critical point. We also have other elements that schools use in terms of doing needs assessments and those kinds of things. And we draw back to the 5 essential survey so that there could be some more data that could validate some of the things that they're seeing in other needs assessments. So, we talk about triangulation. So these are various data points that can help a school really get a good sense and make a point about why we need to do, social emotional training or trauma informed or, other elements. And Illinois has social emotional learning standards. And so I think that we try to find as many reasons and ways that this data and this information can help a student become stronger, help a school become stronger, and so that success continues to be a part of what we experience.
And from Ohio's perspective, this is a really sort of a brand new investment that we're making in schools. We are asking all of them to complete annual reporting on how they're investing and how many kids they've supported, and the types of strategies that they're investing in. Our hope is longitudinally we'll see some impact on attendance and disciplinary rates and all of those things. But really, we've taken more of a technical assistance approach for schools. So in the planning process, we've been very hands-on, helping to connect them to peers who are really sort of shining stars in the whole child effort. So it's been more focused on technical assistance and supporting schools. This is uncharted territory for many of our schools, so at least in Ohio. So really, we've been doing a lot of hand-holding and supporting rather than any sort of punitive approach to schools not doing exactly what we want. So that's how we've approached in Ohio.
Thank you both for that. Just to draft a little bit off of Lizette's questions, we have several questions coming in related to stakeholder engagement. There's probably 4 to 5. So to sum up, I'd love to just start with Krupa. If you can share a little bit about lessons learned or promising practices for states to actively engage students and to integrate student voice. And then, of course, Superintendent Ayala and LeeAnne, if you have anything else to add on that. Beyond students, what are other stakeholders that can be engaged? How have they been engaged in other states? And what does it look like to have a school climate framework that really is inclusive?
Yeah, I think that this conversation is a great start, in including intergenerational conversations and talks is something incredibly vital to the success of an education policy. Students are the ones to best tell whether a policy works in their school or not. And I think that engaging in meaningful student voice is something key to that, to education being successful. I saw in the chat somewhere, somebody asked about how can we ensure that student voice isn't tokenized in this moment. And I do think that that's something really important. And something we like to distinguish at the student voice team is meaningful student voice and non-meaningful student voice. And we really see meaningful student voice as students being at the table at all parts of the decision-making process. So students aren't just, consulted after the fact and given a survey after a policy is being made. They're brought to the table as the policy is being drafted and being created. And their input is something that is actually valued and is something that is taken into account as policymakers are creating that. So I think that engaging in meaningful student voice is something key to creating policies that are conducive to all students in the systems.
I would add to that, that is so important, Krupa. Some of the things that we do in Illinois, we have a student advisory council that has students representing all areas of the state and very, very diverse. And each of the student advisory council has taken on some topics that are in our state strategic plan. And they are doing some research and they are bringing forward some recommendations for statewide kinds of things. We also know that, there are task forces and committees that are also exploring and making recommendations that would impact policy. We've made it a point to make sure that we have student voices also on those task forces and committees. And so I think that, we have the 5 Essential Survey. From 4th grade through 12th grade, students participate in this survey, but that's just the survey. We also have to walk the talk, and we also have to show, to the public and model how students are engaged. So the survey is just a piece of the puzzle. There are other opportunities where students should be a part of this conversation, and we need to show that and value that.
In Ohio, we have incredibly close partnerships with our Prevention Action Alliance, which seed funds youth-led prevention all across the state. And I think that it's an incredibly powerful tool for students to be active in identifying the needs of their community and developing responses and initiatives designed to address the needs of their student body, whether that's stress or behavioral health or substance use disorder or whatever it may be. So that's a way that we've really tried to work with communities at a local level to engage individuals, students on really designing interventions to support the needs of their classmates.
We have a couple of questions that have come in that are related to accountability. And I know Superintendent Ayala, you spoke a little bit to how you do this in Illinois, but there's a question around the connection between high stakes accountability and school climate surveys. And so just wanted to point to a couple of examples that are featured within the report to describe how states are doing this so far, in addition to what Superintendent Ayala described in Illinois, which is to say that many states integrated student engagement, or some states integrated student engagement surveys as part of their measures of school quality and school success in their ESSA plans. North Dakota is probably the state that has gone the furthest, including it as 5% of their measures for how they're identifying schools for improvement. And so we feature North Dakota as an example to look there. We also look at how states are integrating data from climate surveys and other feedback on climate into public report cards. So feature South Carolina, New Mexico, and Illinois there for more information about how parents can learn about how parents and other stakeholders can learn about how information is being reported. And then to Superintendent Ayala's point around accountability for improvement, accountability for participation, not necessarily accountability for having climate initiatives. So I just wanted to turn it to any of our panelists and see if you had any other reactions to this question around the connection between what high stakes accountability is, how our question asker posed it, and school climate.
I'll dive in. One of the things that is very important, and in the work that I've done the last 38 years as an equity advocate champion, is that culture and climate isn't something that you do, for example, at the beginning of the year with a professional development event. It isn't a special family night that you do in the spring. It's something that has to be embedded and felt within the fabric of the day-to-day activities and life of that school, of that district, of that community. And so I think that's really, really important that, you know, setting accountability aside, there does need to be time, attention, energy, and intentionality about making sure that we're constantly checking what the climate is, what the culture is, you know, where are there some potential hotspots or points of celebration. And it's something that is a part of what we do on a day-to-day basis.
All right. Well, why don't we ask you one more question? Or do we want to go to audience Q&A? Danielle, are we pretty much through that already?
Oh, these many of these are the audience Q&A.
Okay, great. Sorry. So I wanted to ask you, ask y'all, like, what are the biggest opportunities you see for this work, and what should state policymakers start prioritizing, and really thinking about how you actually make this happen? I think that's the part that sometimes people get in and think, how do we really operationalize this, right, at an SEA level, and then really be able to build and support and, you know, remove the barriers that could be happening at the local level to make this work even stronger. Love to hear your thoughts.
So I'll jump in. I think my biggest piece of advice is to just start doing it. You know, my boss was the state attorney general, which I don't think many people really identify with, you know, school climate advocacy. And he was able to carry it successfully into his new role as Ohio's attorney general. So regardless of what position you're in, I'd say just get started. Second, I think that it's really, really critical that this is perceived as a community level effort. It cannot just be the responsibility of our school districts. There has to be engagement from students, parents, teachers. You have to have teacher buy-in, but also, you know, community behavioral health providers, physical health care providers, your social service providers. This cannot just be the sole responsibility of our school district. And we really, really need community engagement and buy-in to make this sustainable and successful long-term. Because, you know, we've seen schools do this on shoestrings. So I know that, you know, money isn't always the solution, but sometimes it helps. But certainly when the money dries up, you want these kind of investments and programs to continue. And I think that through community level engagement, you're going to have that sustainability.
What I would add to that, and LeeAnne made some really, really great important points about the inclusiveness of this work and how important it is. But I would emphasize equity. You know, different communities may need different supports. Equal is not equitable. And they may need different types of changes to improve and nurture the goal of having a very healthy culture and climate. And that's why it is important to listen to students, to parents, to teachers, to community partners who have lived the history of that school community and its challenges. In one community, equity may mean that we need to have a greater emphasis on culturally responsive practices. In another community, that may mean that we may need more support in really understanding and providing supports for trauma. In another, equity may mean increasing access to diverse and rigorous courses. And so this whole school culture and climate and school improvement and equity are not a one size fits all. And that's why it's so important to have all of the stakeholder voices at the table in the conversation.
Could I add just one more thing too? You know, I think certainly there are dozens and dozens and hundreds of competing interests for, you know, SEAs and governor's offices right now with the pandemic. Ohio was able to leverage just a small amount of our gear fund to help support refresher trauma-informed training for our professionals on a regional basis. And we've been able to kind of partner our Human Services Division with our Department of Education to, do a refresher training for teachers on how to have difficult conversations. If you think a child is in danger or in need, how do you have those conversations in a safe way with a child? We know that kids are going to be coming back into schools with new and different kinds of needs. So just continuing to leverage even small amounts of those gear funds or, flexible CRF funds. I think there are creative strategies where you can take a little bit of money and go a long way to do some of those refresher trainings that ultimately result in better mental and, wellness outcomes for our kids.
One of the features of a focus on climate that we dig into a little bit in the report is actually the opportunity to disaggregate the data by student group. So you can determine how are African-American girls experiencing their sense of belonging versus white boys or however, and identify trends and identify gaps and identify changes over time. You can look at differences across schools, and you could also compare or crosswalk with other sources of data, which is in fact is a recommendation of the report, to look at chronic absenteeism right next to climate and to look at all of that right next to academic data so that you have multiple measures. So you're getting a real true sense of what is happening within the school and how different student groups are experiencing so that you can provide more tailored, more relevant supports. And there's a couple of districts that we have learned from that have had great success using this very disaggregated approach to solutions, and those are featured in there as well. And we also recommend ways that states can enable that type of work in districts by providing dashboards for districts to analyze their data and providing supports for districts and schools to build communities of practice around specific areas of focus. So there's lots of ways to really foster action related to equity and to a sense of belonging that all of our panelists are speaking about today. So we are coming to the end of our panel discussion. I just want to open it back up to all of our panelists to share any closing remarks or resources that you have, and acknowledge that we've had lots of questions for more specifics, and we will share specific links to each of the initiatives, programs, models, legislation that has been shared, but all of that is also in the report, so I encourage you to check that out as well. So for closing remarks, I'll turn first to you, LeeAnne.
Well, I just want to thank everybody who's on the webinar this morning. I think just demonstrating an interest in whole child initiatives and, really investing in the social and emotional well-being of our kids is absolutely critical. So kudos to, everybody who's on this call. I want to thank CRUPA for really highlighting student voice and elevating that and reminding us all that the adults in the room don't always have the answers. So it's critical that we engage all of our kids. So thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Lizzette, for the opportunity.
Great. Superintendent Ayala.
Thank you. Thank you, Danielle and Lizzette, and to the Aspen Institute for this critical and very important work. More importantly, for the resource that will be available for everyone to look at and learn from, and lots of examples from across the nation. I think it's so important. We share so many things, but yet we are so unique from each other. And I think that conversations like this are really great to learn from each other. And I think that when we have conversations like this and we can, have deep insights into what may be occurring and how our students are experiencing their learning, and really trying to address some of those needs and some of those things that our students are thinking about with so much today, the pandemic, the racial tensions, the global climate impact. It's just so many things that students are concerned with today that maybe they were not concerned with before. How can school climate and culture also drive instruction and really use that as a leverage to engage students more in learning and problem solving? So thank you. Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you to my colleagues. I learned from your experiences. Thank you for sharing.
Absolutely. Thank you. We'll turn to Krupa, and then Lizzette, you can close us out.
Yeah, I just wanted to start off by saying thank you to Danielle and my fellow panelists for being so wonderful and hosting this really, really fruitful intergenerational dialogue. I thoroughly enjoyed hearing about what's going on in Illinois and in Ohio, and learning about how, there's so many different methods to collecting student voice and making sure that students have agency in their schools. I think just something I wanted to close out with was really noting that, students are different, and every student has a different experience with every school. Despite the school climate might being the same programs, the same teachers, every student's experience of that is different. So meeting students where they are at and collecting their student voice from where they are is something that I think is so key to being able to create a conducive school climate environment for everyone. I think I mentioned this in the chat, but surveys may not be the best thing for everyone. Sometimes just speaking directly to a student is the best way to get their student voice. So really meeting students where they're at and ensuring that we're listening to all students, whether they're the ones that are most heard in a system or least heard in a system, and collecting all of that student voice is something that'll make school climate better for everyone in that school.
Thank you so much, all of y'all. This was always a great opportunity to be able to connect with folks that are doing the work day to day. I think the other thing about this is really an opportunity for us to really focus and put our kids first. In light of everything that's happening in our country, the polarization and the inability to really engage in civil discourse, if we can really look at this issue, just look at our panel. It's a bipartisan group of and intergenerational group of folks that are really interested in this work. And if we can just really think about how this is going to make kids first, where we need to put our resources, our efforts, and our ability to really, not only push learning to a different level, but also push the way we engage with our kids on the campus and outside of the campus too, with our parents, right? Our families that are out there depending on the schools to really build that support. And that's what COVID really brought to them was, oh my gosh, this is my community. How can I become a big part of it and be engaged with it as well? So again, thank you for the opportunity. I learned so much. I took so many notes because it's just a real privilege. So thank you.
Great. Thank you all. And thanks to all of the participants and attendees for joining today for the active conversation in our little Zoom Brady Bunch boxes and also in the chat box as well as on Twitter. So just wanted to flag that if you represent an organization that would want to sign on to the letter of support, you can do so by emailing educationinfo@aspeninstitute.org. And in addition to the playbook, we also have a handy infographic to very quickly and easily explain what climate is and how states can lead on school climate action. We also have a two-pager, I think, around federal funding streams and how states can leverage all of the funding streams that exist, particularly with stimulus and CARES fund dollars to help support their school climate efforts, as well as lots of other collateral and resources, examples, as I mentioned, 38 states plus DC. So lots to look at, lots to learn from, lots of links, lots of research, hopefully something for everyone. And to add, many of the resources are free. And so we do feature examples of surveys that have been validated and are publicly available, particularly from the US Department of Education, which has a great resource as well. So encourage folks to dig into the playbook, to dig into the resources, and to stay in touch so we can continue to learn from each other. But with that, I want to thank everyone again for your participation, for the conversation, and most importantly, for all of the work that you do to support students. Thank you.